By the early 1970s, the Western was on its way out. Studios that had built empires on Stetsons and stagecoaches were watching audiences drift towards science fiction, paranoia thrillers, and counterculture road movies, and a generation of directors fresh out of New Hollywood took the genre apart on the way down. Some of them made the most quietly devastating Westerns of the entire decade. Almost nobody saw them. These 13 films were buried by bad timing, hostile critics, indifferent studios, or an audience that had simply moved on, and most of them have never come back. We're starting in the summer of 1971, with a directorial debut so slow and so beautiful that the studio gave up on it before the second reel. Slow horses against a yellowing sky, dust hanging in the late afternoon light, a soundtrack that drifts more than it scores. This was what Peter Fonda's directorial debut asked of an audience 2 years after Easy Rider, and Universal quickly discovered the answer it was getting back. The studio had wanted another counterculture lightning strike, marketable to the same kids who had filled drive-ins for the motorcycle picture. What it got was a meditative Western about regret, return, and a stillness that does not survive contact with a 9 p.m. Friday night crowd. The two films share a star and almost nothing else. Fonda and Warren Oates play two drifters who circle back, after years of nothing, to the wife Fonda abandoned. The role is given a steady and unsentimental gravity by Verna Bloom, who refuses to play the part as either a victim or a stoic. Vilmos Zsigmond shot it the year before he made Deliverance, and his work here turns nearly every frame into something between a memory and a mirage. The picture has no real interest in plot momentum. It moves the way a long afternoon moves, and that pace was exactly what cost it any chance of finding its viewers in the year of The French Connection and A Clockwork Orange. The script asks a 1971 audience to feel the weight of an absent decade in a long silence on a porch. Most of that audience was looking for car chases. Universal cut its losses fast. The picture was demoted to second feature status, ran for a few weeks on the bottom of double bills, and slipped off drive-in marquees within a single summer. It became almost overnight a film that audiences in 1971 had simply walked past on their way to something louder. Critics returned to it later. The cinematography aged into something close to legend, and a small and devoted following grew up around bootleg prints in the years before home video made it findable. The original commercial life of the project, however, ended the moment it stopped being convenient to a programmer's schedule. And that is how one of the most patient and beautiful Westerns of the decade ended up missing from almost every list that matters. Every Tombstone film up to that point had given audiences the same story. A clean, lethal Doc Holliday at Wyatt Earp's right hand, a glittering frontier town, and a gunfight at the end that decided who the heroes were. Frank Perry's Doc discarded all of that on the way in. His Holliday, played by Stacy Keach, is a man held together by tuberculosis, self-medication, and the simple refusal to lie down yet. His Wyatt, played by Harris Yulin, is a calculating local politician with no obvious moral center. And his Kate Elder, played by Faye Dunaway, is given a face and a temper that no studio publicity department of the previous 40 years would have allowed near a lobby card. Audiences who walked in expecting John Ford walked out somewhere else entirely. The picture arrived in the same season as Robert Altman's McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and it shared the same project of stripping the gold leaf off a national myth. Tombstone, as the film tells it, is not a stage for moral clarity, but a place where ambition, bodily wreckage, and a few accidents of timing decide who gets remembered as a hero. Pete Hamill's screenplay refuses the conventional gunfight beats. The famous OK Corral confrontation is staged not as a set piece, but as a brief, ugly, almost embarrassing exchange. There is no swelling score behind it, no slow walk into the street, no moment of frontier justice. Perry's camera treats the whole episode the way a coroner treats a cause of death. By the time the dust settles, the audience has been asked to consider that the men who built the legend may have built it largely to flatter themselves, and that is not a thought a 1971 family night ticket buyer was generally hoping for. United Artists could not figure out how to sell what it had. Reviews were divided, the Ford-era audience refused to follow, and the film slipped out of circulation so completely that a whole generation of Western fans grew up without ever knowing it existed. Late-night television passed it over in favor of safer Earp pictures. Home video releases were sporadic and short-lived, the prints often in poor shape. The question the production asks, whether the most famous gunfight in American legend was anything more than a squalid civic dispute settled by men who later got to write their own version, is one the genre has rarely answered as squarely since. Whether audiences would have eventually come around if the picture had stayed in front of them is, at this distance, anyone's guess. 3 Oscar-caliber leads, less than a month on American screens. A near-total commercial collapse for one of the most concentrated displays of acting talent the Western had assembled in years. Gene Hackman had just won the Oscar for The French Connection. Oliver Reed was a dominant force in European cinema. Candice Bergen had been a fixture of American film for half a decade. The combination should have been enough to fill any theater on the cast alone. Instead, what they made together in 1971 met the most concentrated critical demolition of any Western that year, and was pulled from the conversation before its first run was finished. The plot is the engine of the controversy. Hackman plays a wealthy and openly cruel cattle baron whose wife, played by Bergen, is taken by a wandering outlaw played by Reed. What begins as a captivity narrative shifts gradually into an indictment of the man supposedly doing the rescuing. Hackman's character becomes the genuine threat, his pursuit framed less as justice than as a long-form expression of ownership. The film refuses to soften any of it. Violence arrives without the genre's usual cushioning of bravura editing or musical signaling, and the harder beats are staged plainly enough to leave the audience nowhere to hide. Reviewers responded the way reviewers in 1971 tended to respond when a Western asked them to look directly at something the genre had spent decades dressing up. Reactions ran from contemptuous to disgusted. Studio support evaporated. American screens that had booked the project switched to safer titles before the second weekend was over. Looked at half a century on, the production reads as a serious and uncompromising work that happened to land in the wrong week of the wrong year for the cultural temperature it required. The exile was thorough. By 1985, the most stacked Western cast of its season was sitting in dollar-bin VHS racks, sleeves sun-faded, with no one in the store asking for it. In the spring of 1972, with American boys still being pulled out of small towns by the Vietnam draft, Robert Benton released his directorial debut about two Civil War teenagers heading west to dodge a different war's call-up. The timing was eerie. The release was disastrous. Audiences were at the multiplex that summer watching Coppola's The Godfather, and Benton's melancholy little picaresque slipped into theaters and out again before anyone really noticed. He'd written Bonnie and Clyde 5 years earlier. He knew exactly what he was doing with a picture this small. He just happened to time it into the wrong July. Jeff Bridges and Barry Brown play the leads, with Bridges fresh off the Last Picture Show and the kind of casting that should have generated more attention than it did. What the two find on the Trail West is essentially a pre-industrial America, stripped of any consoling myth. Benton's Kansas is dust and indifference and small mean violences, with prairie skies that read more like a sepia-toned bad dream than a frontier of opportunity. Bridges was already working at a level most actors don't reach in a career, and Brown matches him scene for scene with a stillness the genre rarely makes room for. The two leads talk past each other the way actual teenagers do, half bragging and half lying about what they know. What's striking, watching it now, is how comfortable Benton was letting the material be small. There are no speeches. No swelling score arrives to tell you how to feel about a long shot of a riverbank. The picaresque drifts rather than builds, the way the protagonists themselves do. What's left of the project today reads to me like an old paperback you'd find in a thrift shop somewhere, yellowed and dog-eared and slightly warped from a basement winter. Somehow, better than half the bestsellers it was sold next to. Paramount had no marketing instinct for it. The audience was at the multiplex watching Pacino, and within a few weeks, the picture had drifted off the schedule the way underrated novels drift off bestseller lists. Nobody asked for it back. We'll be returning to that thrift shop feeling later in this list. The next entry is from the same year and the same impulse, with the consoling myth stripped down to something even harder. Cowboying is something you do when you can't do nothing else. That line was the marketing department's last attempt to sell what Dick Richards had actually delivered. The picture had been bought as a coming-of-age Western for the teen heartthrob audience, with Gary Grimes fresh off Summer of '42 in the lead. What the studio screened when the prints came back from the lab was something else entirely. Richards stripped every romantic notion out of the cowboy myth and handed audiences something muddy, exhausted, and devastating. Grimes plays Ben Mockridge, a starry-eyed boy who signs onto a cattle drive expecting glory and finds dust, casual brutality, and a trail boss with no time for the romance the genre was supposed to be selling. Frank Culpepper, the foreman, is played by Billy Greenbush as a man who has run out of patience for any version of the West that does not involve getting cattle from one place to another. The cinematography by Lawrence Edward Williams and Ralph Woolsey treats the frontier as a place that has already worn its inhabitants down. There is no swell of music to soften the long stretches of nothing. Men die without ceremony, and not all of them are bad men. The cattle move the way real cattle move, slowly, and without the assistance of a stunt coordinator. The result was a coming-of-age picture whose central lesson was that the thing the boy had been coming of age toward was not worth the journey. The 1972 audience that had been promised Summer of '42 on horseback did not return for a second weekend. Reviews were better than the box office, but better did not save the picture. 20th Century Fox let the film drift out of circulation. The marketing posters that had hung in college dorms in the spring came down by the fall, and the bleakest Western of the decade slipped into the cinematic graveyard it had effectively earned. The picture never had a meaningful second life. It rarely surfaced on television, was inconsistently issued on home video, and the half-century since has done nothing to widen its audience. Almost nobody under 50 has ever seen it. Something didn't add up about the picture's release. The film had Robert Aldrich's signature, Burt Lancaster's name above the title, and a script with the kind of moral seriousness audiences were supposed to be hungry for in 1972. What got into theaters on either side of the Atlantic was not what Aldrich had finished. The American cut underperformed. The European cut, after the studio's intervention, played in a form Aldrich had not approved. By the time both versions had finished their first runs, one of the masterworks of his career was already drifting toward the kind of late-night television exile from which films do not generally return. The premise is austere. Lancaster plays a weathered Army scout assigned to track an Apache war party led by Ulzana, who has broken from the reservation and is moving across Arizona with calculated brutality. Bruce Davison plays the idealistic young lieutenant nominally in command of the pursuit, who has arrived from West Point with the conviction that humane warfare is possible against an enemy fighting on different terms. The film's dramatic engine is the slow erosion of that conviction, and the equally slow recognition that the violence on both sides is not the result of misunderstanding, but of incompatible commitments. Aldrich and screenwriter Alan Sharp refused to encode a clean victim and a clean aggressor. Jorge Luke, as the Apache scout Canite attached to the Army's pursuit, holds the moral center of the picture without ever being asked to deliver a speech about it. The Apache violence is graphic and unrelieved. The Army's response, when the lieutenant authorizes it, is no less so. Joseph Birock's cinematography keeps the cruelty in clean, unsensational frames, with no formal cushioning to tell an audience how to feel about what it is watching. Audiences walked out of preview screenings, and word of those walkouts traveled before the picture had finished its first theatrical week. Critics divided sharply over whether the project was a humanist masterpiece or an exercise in nihilism dressed in cavalry uniform. The Vietnam reading was unavoidable in 1972. The premise of an idealistic young officer leading a pursuit through hostile territory under a commanding officer who no longer believed in the mission was, for any audience that read a newspaper, not a metaphor that needed unpacking. Whether Aldrich intended the parallel as the central engine of the picture or as one resonance among several has been argued for 50 years. The director gave conflicting answers in interviews. The screenwriter offered a different reading. The picture itself does not adjudicate. By 1981, a chopped-up version of the American cut was airing on UHF channels in the late-night slot, between insurance commercials and reruns of half-forgotten cop shows. Whether the audience flipping past it understood what they were almost watching is a question the historical record does not answer. Whether they would have stayed if they had is a different question, and not one with an obvious answer either. The first time I saw it, I thought I was watching outtakes from someone else's film. A frontier town shot like a wet animal pen, the streets ankle-deep in something gray and cold, the buildings leaning the wrong way, a teenage Billy the Kid played by Michael J. Pollard as a half-witted boy with food on his shirt. Stan Dragoti had been a successful ad director in New York, and his debut feature looks like nothing else from the era. It looks honestly like nothing else from any era. A century of dime novels and matinee posters had given audiences a single Billy the Kid. Dirty Little Billy throws all of that out the saloon window before the first reel is over. Pollard is the secret weapon of the picture. He plays Billy not as a juvenile gunslinger awaiting his legend, but as a confused, slightly frightened kid in a town that has no use for him. The supporting cast around him has the same pulled from the mud quality. Lee Purcell plays the dance hall woman who half tolerates him. Richard Evans plays the older companion who half uses him. Nobody in the picture appears to have a destiny. Ralph Woolsey's camera treats the frontier town the way a documentary would treat a refugee camp. There is no John Ford composition, no establishing shot framed for the eventual poster. The result is closer to a lost Sam Peckinpah outtake than a conventional 1972 Western. And the closer I look at it, the more it reminds me of the Czech New Wave films the studios were importing the same year, where ordinary people stood in ordinary rooms and the meaning had to be assembled by the viewer. The 1972 audience that bought a ticket for a Billy the Kid picture had no instructions for any of this, nor did the studio. Columbia released it briefly, attempted no real marketing campaign, and let it slip from the schedule once the first weekend's numbers came in. The picture has been a holy grail for Western completists ever since, surfacing intermittently on cable, briefly on VHS, more reliably as a half-rumored title that the genre's archivists keep recommending to one another. What I keep coming back to, watching it now, is the strange tenderness of it. The picture refuses to make Billy a folk hero, but it also refuses to treat him as a freak. It just lets him be a kid in a frontier that does not particularly want him. Whether 1972 audiences would have caught up to it on a wider release, or whether the project was always going to be a private discovery passed from one viewer to the next, is a question I genuinely cannot answer. On the surface, the story should have been an easy sell. Dennis Hopper, 4 years after Easy Rider, plays a young outlaw trying to live straight, taking honest work in a small Texas town in the early years of the 20th century. Underneath, the picture is about something the studio could not figure out how to put in a trailer. The frontier in this telling has been replaced by a wage economy that cannot tolerate a man like the protagonist any better than the old wilderness ever could. There is no longer a horizon to ride toward. There is only a foreman, a clock, and a paycheck small enough to make ordinary virtue feel like a kind of theft. Director James Frawley, working from a script by Edwin Shrake, treats the predicament with a quiet, almost embarrassed melancholy. Hopper plays Bickford Wainer with the post-counterculture exhaustion the role requires. The supporting cast carries the rest of the indictment. Warren Oates appears as a married friend offering the protagonist the spare room and a complicated approximation of domestic life. Ben Johnson, in one of his wonderful late career turns, plays the local sheriff. Peter Boyle is a self-styled spiritual visionary running a small workshop on the edge of town. The world the project assembles is recognizable in 1973 as something close to the suburbs of an actual American disenchantment. 20th Century Fox, which had bought the project as a Hopper-led counterculture western, had no clear strategy for selling a film whose central observation was that there was no longer anywhere left for its protagonist to go. The release was a quiet collapse. Reviews were mixed, the ad campaign was confused, and the picture left theaters without the kind of cult buzz that often saved a Hopper-adjacent project of the period. It became, for the next several decades, a title that turned up on lists of unfairly forgotten westerns and almost nowhere else. The picture, as an artifact, is now better known to the people who lost money on it than to the people who would actually love it. Frawley never directed a theatrical western again. Lee Marvin made better westerns than this, and almost all of them are easier to find. That, more than any other single fact, is what places the Spikes Gang on a list of forgotten 1970s westerns half a century after its release. The premise was strong, the cast was striking on paper, the execution was patient and serious. None of it was enough to give the picture a second weekend. Director Richard Fleischer assembled a story that worked best when read as a sour fairy tale. Marvin's Harry Spikes, a wounded outlaw, is found by 3 farm boys, played by Gary Grimes, Ron Howard, and Charles Martin Smith, who nurse him back to health and, in return, are given an education in the trade he practices. The setup invites the conventional moral arc. The picture refuses to deliver it. The boys are not redeemed by exposure to a worldlier man, and Spikes is not softened by his exposure to their innocence. What the project sketches instead is the slow erosion of 3 fundamentally decent kids by a mentor whose own decency, if it ever existed, has been used up well before the first scene. Fleischer keeps the violence brief and unsensational. The cast plays it without commentary, which gives the bleakness more room than a louder treatment would. United Artists released the picture into a market saturated with disaster pictures, releases tied to the towering inferno and earthquake swallowing the publicity oxygen for any smaller, soberer film. The box office was poor, the reviews split, the project disappeared from the conversation within a season and never quite came back, even as Howard's later directing career turned him into one of the most recognizable names in American cinema. To this day, even completist Howard fans rarely bring the picture up. It exists on the historical record, mostly as an unhappy footnote. Something about the marketing didn't add up. A western directed by Frank Perry, who had recently made Doc. A screenplay by Thomas McGuane, fresh from a literary career that had made him a name. A soundtrack by Jimmy Buffett. A cast led by Jeff Bridges and Sam Waterston. By every reasonable accounting, the package should have walked into a respectable opening week. Instead, the picture limped into theaters in 1975, played to confused matinee crowds, and was off the schedule before any clear audience for it had been found. The confusion was structural. Rancho Deluxe is a neo-western about 2 modern-day cattle rustlers drifting through Montana with no particular plan and less urgency. Bridges and Waterston play the leads with a comic looseness the picture asks an audience to share. Slim Pickens shows up as the cattleman dispatched to track them down, and his patience for the assignment is, like everything else in the film, perfectly out of step with the genre's expected rhythms. McGuane's screenplay is talky and observational, more interested in the texture of bored small-town Montana than in any actual rustling. Perry shoots the picture in the long, sun-warmed afternoons that make the whole thing feel like a long roadside bar conversation in which the screen door never quite closes. The audience that had been promised a comedy western was given something stranger and quieter. The audience that wanted neo-counterculture cinema was given a film with no particular politics, and the audience that had liked McGuane's novels was, in 1975, too small to fill a multiplex on its own. Found now on streaming or in a battered VHS bin, the picture plays exactly the way it should have always been understood. It is not a comedy western, not a neo-western, not a McGuane adaptation in the conventional sense. It is its own thing, and its own thing is good. It plays frankly the way that yellowed paperback we mentioned earlier reads, better than half the bestsellers it was sold next to, and almost nobody on the original sales floor knew what to do with it. The next picture takes the same year, the same instinct towards something quieter than the genre wanted, and gives it to a director and a star who knew exactly how badly the country needed a hard look in the mirror. The Marshal in Posse spends the whole picture looking like a hero, which is exactly the point. Kirk Douglas, in the dual role of director and lead, stages himself as the kind of square-jawed lawman the genre had been celebrating for decades, efficient, intelligent, popular, and visibly bound for higher office. By the final scene, the moral arithmetic of the picture has flipped completely, and what looked like a competent crime and punishment narrative reveals itself as something considerably bleaker. I'd argue that's one of the cleanest reversals any 1970s Western pulled off, and almost nobody noticed. The setup is straightforward enough on the surface. Douglas plays Howard Nightingale, an ambitious U.S. Marshal pursuing a charming train robber across the Arizona Territory in the run-up to a planned Senate campaign. Bruce Dern, doing the kind of layered work that made him one of the decade's most underused leads, plays the outlaw Jack Strawhorn. The pursuit goes about as expected for 2/3 of the running time. Douglas marshals his posse, the public follows the manhunt, the local press treats the Marshal as a campaign in motion. What the picture does in the last act is something I find genuinely interesting from an analytical standpoint. The capture happens, and then the capture comes apart. Strawhorn turns out to know more about the Marshal's political ambitions than the Marshal had counted on, and what looked like a triumph of frontier law becomes a slow, painful exposure of the calculations behind it. Douglas, as a director, refuses to soften the conclusion. The audience is left with a public figure who has been unmade in private without any of his constituents noticing. Bicentennial-era audiences watching this in 1975 in the long shadow of Watergate were not necessarily ready to be told another story about how the men who rise are the men who hide the most. Or maybe they were exhausted by being told, and another telling was simply too much. Paramount could not get traction on the marketing campaign. Critics were respectful, but not enthusiastic. The picture played a holdover week or two in small towns and then drifted off the schedule. Whether the project was simply badly timed for a country that had just lived through 2 years of presidential disgrace, or whether 1975 audiences sensed correctly that the picture was rubbing salt where it did not need any rubbing, is a question I am still not sure has a single right answer. Within a month of release, the picture had vanished from American screens. That was the speed of the disappearance for a film starring Charlton Heston and James Coburn at the height of their respective marketability, working with a director who had handled major studio productions for 2 decades. The vanishing was so thorough that the project did not even leave behind the residual paperback rack's second life most mid-budget star vehicles of its era managed to scrape together. By the time 20th Century Fox was sorting through its catalog for the home video market in the 1980s, the picture was already an inventory item nobody was asking about. The setup carried real promise. Heston plays Sam Brigade, a retired Arizona lawman dragged out of his quiet last years to chase down an escaped killer played by Coburn. Director Andrew V. McLaglen had spent his career staging exactly this kind of confrontation, and the pairing of Heston and Coburn carried with it the weight of 2 performers who knew by 1976 that the genre that had built their careers was no longer going to support them through the next phase of it. The melancholy in the picture is partly fictional and partly true. The script, adapted from a Brian Garfield novel, leans on the inevitability of the chase. The actors, in their physical weariness and the small kindnesses they extend each other in the few moments of shared screen time, lean on something larger. There is a quiet scene midway through the film where Heston, dust-caked and tired, stops his horse and looks across a sun-bleached plain, and the camera holds on his face long enough that the audience is meant to read the entire genre's exhaustion into the shot. Whether the audience in 1976 read it that way is a different question. Most of them never showed up to find out. What the project carries now, 50 years on, is the strange dignity of a film that knew exactly what it was. By 1977, Star Wars had rewritten what an American multiplex audience would line up for, and the kind of dusty lawman and killer western the project represents stopped being a viable studio investment almost overnight. The horizon that opens comes a Horseman is the kind of sky a postcard tries to be. Pale pink fading into rose fading into the long blue wash of a Montana dusk, with cattle moving in low silhouette against it, and Gordon Willis's camera holding the frame long enough that the audience can feel the year settling. Willis, who had spent the decade defining how American cinema looked in low light, treats the entire picture as a slow elegy for the kind of country and the kind of films that were already disappearing as he shot it. By 1978, when Alan J. Pakula released the project into theaters, the Western had only 1 foot left in the multiplex. The picture knows it. The picture is, more or less, about it. The story is set in 1945, in a Montana valley where a struggling rancher named Ella Connors, played by Jane Fonda, is being squeezed off her land by a cattle baron named Jacob Ewing, played by Jason Robards. James Caan plays Frank Athern, a haunted veteran returning from the Pacific who comes to her assistance and gradually to her side. The setup is conventional in outline and entirely unconventional in execution. Pakula, who had made All the President's Men 2 years earlier, brings the same patience to small rooms and unspoken decisions. Fonda plays Ella with a wariness that refuses to ease into romance, even when the script appears to ask for it. Caan plays Athern with a stillness that is not stoicism but something quieter, the bearing of a man who has spent the war trying not to use the parts of himself that the war required. Robards, as Ewing, gives a performance of accumulated grievance that anchors the picture's view of the late frontier as a place where the old ranchers had simply outlived the conditions that made them necessary. What lifts the project from a conventional rancher versus baron narrative is the tone Willis and Pakula sustain across 2 hours of running time. The picture is shot almost entirely in the so-called golden hour, the long stretch of dusk and dawn light that turns the Montana landscape into something a viewer can almost reach into. Color saturation is muted, shadows are long. The interiors of the ranch house glow with kerosene rather than tungsten. Many of the most important scenes happen at the threshold between exterior and interior, with characters framed in doorways looking out at the land they are about to lose or about to fight for. The cumulative effect, watched now, is of a film that already knows it is a goodbye. Whether Pakula intended that explicitly or whether the genre's exhaustion simply found its way into the production through 1,000 unconscious choices made by everyone involved, the result is the same. Comes a Horseman arrived in late 1978 to respectful but underwhelmed reviews, played a moderate first run, and quietly closed out the decade for a kind of American film that, by the next summer, the multiplex had effectively stopped making. By the time Comes a Horseman arrived in 1978, the Western had effectively left the multiplex. Star Wars had rewritten what an audience showed up for, and the kind of dusty, contemplative, morally complicated frontier picture that these 13 films represent simply stopped getting made. That's part of what makes this corner of film history so strange and so worth digging back into. These weren't B-movies or cheap programmers. They starred Hackman, Heston, Lancaster, Fonda, Marvin, Coburn, Caan, Bridges, all of them at the absolute peak of their craft, working with directors who treated the genre as serious adult drama. They lost mostly to disaster pictures, blockbusters, and changing tastes, and they slipped into a quiet kind of obscurity that even die-hard Western fans rarely correct. If a few of these get added to your watch list tonight, leave a like to help more people find them. Drop a comment with the one you're tracking down first, and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep cut from a genre everyone thinks they already know.